Let me welcome you again, for those here and for those online, welcome to the second annual Milliken Dialogues. And we've purposely used the word dialogue to describe this event because, look over there. There's not a lot of dialogue in Washington, D.C. these days. There's a lot of monologue. And we learned from our founder that these difficult conversations are actually what advances policy and advances work on behalf of students. And so we hope that today will be a dialogue. The young people who work with me tell me that there is something called the Twitter and the socials that you can all use to keep track of us throughout the day. Please use hashtag CIS Dialogues as you do that, because we want you to engage with the panel and we want you to engage with the audience who's participating with us online. Bill Milliken really made a career of reaching across the aisles and engaging in dialogue with diverse audiences, and so we hope to continue that today. Now, if you're closer to my age than some of the young people with whom I work, you might think about today's topic and related to student discipline, and you would remember, I think, in the 1990s, a time when schools across America began to adopt zero-tolerance policies. Schools did this for all the right reasons, to safeguard against disruptive and violent behavior. And there was a spike in the number of suspensions and expulsions handed out by schools nationwide. However, many of those same strict policies are now applied to infractions such as insubordination, dress code violation, and missing class. And yet all of these behaviors actually might be cries for help from a student and not something that really should be subject to zero tolerance. 10 years ago, when I worked at the 5th largest school district in America, we struggled with the implications of a zero tolerance policy. And subsequent to that, I struggled with the issue as the state superintendent of public instruction in my home state. I learned in my last jobs, just like many of you, I think, that we must look deeper than the policy itself. We must look at the people impacted, students and families and teachers. You'll hear a lot today about zero tolerance policies and what happens if those policies are eliminated without proper training. I suspect you will hear dialogue about unintended consequences at both ends of that spectrum. At communities and schools, our school-based staff are experts at identifying root causes and assessing their impact on student behavior. We know that when students are empowered with the appropriate supports to address the multiple barriers they may face, and they are provided with necessary social emotional skills to self-regulate, we can reduce the need for disciplinary referrals. But this approach alone won't solve the deep inequities in school discipline rates. Let's face it, students of color and students with disabilities are disciplined at much higher rates than their peers. Sit with that for a minute. A Governmental Accountability Office report issued in 2018 analyzed school data and found that these disparities are widespread and persistent, regardless of the type of disciplinary action, level of school poverty, or type of public school. Ultimately, these disparities often mean that more children of color and children with disabilities are pushed from the classroom into courtrooms, something we all know as the school-to-prison pipeline. It's our hope that you leave this room, or for those of you watching online, that you close your browser, with concrete steps for policy and practice to change this national trend. We may not agree at the end of the morning, and we may leave with different steps that we wish to take, but we hope that the dialogue will be held and will matter. An overarching question for today's summit is this: how can we work together to reverse the trend of criminalization and address the systemic inequities that we see in the federal data that I just talked about? And I would add, how do we as a sector account for individual implicit biases that may be contributing to systemic failure? Today, we will ask you to consider many different perspectives in pursuit of answers to those questions. Because if we, the adults, don't step in to provide support for trauma and offer students coping strategies on how to control their behavior, kids will continue to show up in courtrooms when what they really need is support. And if we do not involve youth in those solutions, we're doomed to fail. That's why today you're going to see two CIS alumni who are much younger than I am. They understand the social media. You're going to see them on this stage participating in this conversation. At the end of the morning, we want you all to ask, Where do we go from here? My organization has a few ideas, which we will be glad to share with you. And we hope to travel the road after this morning together, or at least keep the dialogue going if we don't agree. Again, follow us on social media, use hashtag CIS Dialogues as you do that, and please participate in today's dialogue. With that, it's time to get started. I would like to welcome to the stage my friend and someone I admire deeply, Communities in Schools Chief of Staff and Vice President for Policy, Tiffany Miller.
Good morning. As I thought about how to prepare for this discussion, I found myself reminiscing about my time in high school. I would like to think it was only a couple of years ago. Actually, that's what we're going to go with. It was only a couple of years ago. But no, seriously, to be honest, parts of my high school experience were very difficult. I remembered missing a lot of school. But as I was preparing for today, I wanted to be more accurate, and so I asked my mom to dig up some of my old report cards, and she found my first semester report card for my senior year. I took 6 classes. 2 classes had 7 absences, and I was tardy 3 times. 2 classes had 9 absences. 1 class had 10, and another had 11. I was at a point where if I missed more school, I wouldn't have graduated. Once the school alerted my parents that there was a problem, I was swarmed with support from my school, from my parents. I needed social emotional support. I suffered from anxiety, and I didn't have the tools, vocabulary, nor maturity to cope. But at that age, as you know, you're not necessarily supposed to. But fortunately, that year, I learned that a caring community can provide the support you need to realize your own potential. And that support is why I am standing here today. The adults in my life knew me well. They saw the root cause of my behavior. They responded by giving me the tools I needed to overcome the challenges I faced. They responded, I was immediately connected to a school counselor. My teachers were made aware that there was an issue and that I simply just wasn't skipping class to be skipping class. I was connected to community resources that helped me graduate from high school on time and go on to college. This is also why I work for Communities in Schools and the 1.6 million students we serve. People aren't born knowing how to manage anxiety, mental health, or trauma. And sometimes a call for help is expressed through behavioral problems. Communities in Schools site coordinators are in schools to identify these root causes like my parents and my school did for me, and equip youth with the right tools and supports to cope. I'm an example of what can happen when a student has the right supports she needs to walk across that graduation stage. But not every student's story ends like mine. Among the nearly 3 million students who are suspended from their schools every year, 18 million days of instruction are lost annually because of school suspensions. 18 million days of instruction. Students who are suspended have lower grades, lower test scores, and are less likely to graduate than their peers. Beyond school, the impact of suspensions can result in longer-term negative life outcomes like increased victimization, criminal involvement, underemployment, and incarceration. As Dale mentioned in his remarks, we also need to be honest about who is impacted by this. It's mostly students of color, boys, and students with disabilities. For both students and teachers, the effect of frequent suspensions can be negative. Studies show that in schools with high rates of removing disruptive students from the classroom, students and teachers report feeling less safe when compared to their peers in schools with lower rates of removal. Yet there's another side to these data, and that's about teachers. According to the indicators of school crime and safety, about 43% of teachers surveyed said student misbehavior interfered with their teaching. A friend of mine recently told me about the tension that had boiled over in her school due to restorative practices replacing zero tolerance policies. She didn't have the support and training she needed to handle classroom management. She eventually left the teaching profession last year. And she told me this was one of the main reasons why. She misses teaching. She's volunteering in her school because she misses being there, but she just couldn't handle the classroom management aspect. Later this morning, we'll hear from another classroom teacher who will discuss the problem of work-related stress and the need to support teachers. Many of us in this room may think we understand the problem and have an idea about which solutions would be most effective. I know I do. On one hand, we must reduce the impact of suspensions on students and eliminate biased decision-making. But on the other, teachers need the tools and classroom management and should be empowered to make decisions. Yet, there are very different perspectives about how we move forward. And since we are having this conversation in Washington, D.C., let's start by considering the federal role in addressing this issue. As many of you know, last year, the U.S. Department of Education rescinded federal guidance about school discipline. According to the Obama administration, the guidance was issued to assist state and local leaders in developing practices and strategies to reduce exclusionary discipline and enhance school climate, and to ensure that those policies and practices comply with federal civil rights law. Some have questioned whether it really achieved any of these goals and if it was the right role for the federal government. During this discussion, we will consider this debate. You will hear from perspectives about the right role for the federal government. How do we protect the civil rights of all students and limit bias in school discipline? How do we ensure that all teachers are well prepared and supported? How do we limit classroom disruptions? I look forward to hearing more. I hope you do as well. Please help me in welcoming to the stage former U.S. Secretary of Education and Managing Director of the Emerson Collective, Arnie Duncan, and Mike Petrelli, President of the Thomas Fordham Institute.
It's great to see you.
Yes, get comfortable. So I imagine the two of you have some thoughts about this issue and this topic. Let's start with where I ended. What is the role of the federal government in ensuring that school disparity no longer exist?
Great. All right. Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here and for this important conversation this morning. Good morning to everybody. So couple of things. First of all, to that question, let's be very clear. There has been a federal role in this area ever since the 1960s and the Civil Rights Acts, and it's an important role. And the role says that if anybody believes that they have been treated unfairly because of their race or because of their membership in another protected class, including that they were suspended or expelled or given some kind of disciplinary punishment that they would not have received were it not for their race, they have a right to file a complaint with the federal government, with the Office for Civil Rights, and to have that complaint investigated. And those investigators, for decades now, have been told that if they go in and they find that, yes, indeed, there is evidence that the decision was made because of that, because of their race, that they have to issue a finding and the district has to change its ways. And that is incredibly important, and that remains in place today and should always remain in place. And we know that there are absolutely instances of that happening. You know, the white kid pulls the fire alarm and gets a slap on the wrist, and the African-American kid pulls a fire alarm and gets a week's suspension, right? That's wrong, and it happens, and we have a system for dealing with it, and that system needs to be defended and protected. The question was whether the 2014 guidance, which in my view went much beyond just providing, quote, guidance in terms of ideas and suggestions, and really at least was interpreted by many on the local level as getting awfully close to a mandate, was getting to the point where it was saying that if there are any disparities in these data, we're going to assume that there is either implicit bias or discriminatory action happening, and that's where we start running into trouble. And we can have that debate, but to some degree it's moot. I mean, the new administration has acted, that guidance has been rescinded. I hope what we can talk about this morning a lot is, given that my sense is many of you in this room have made up your minds, you want to pursue discipline reform. And many schools out there want to pursue discipline reform. And that's great. The question is how to make sure that reform goes well, and what can we learn from other reforms in other areas, whether it's around Common Core, around teacher evaluation, anything where we're trying to get schools to change, to have it go well. You mentioned teachers. We need to talk about that. The teachers, every time we survey teachers, and we have a new survey coming out from the Fordham Institute in a few months, the teachers are saying, help, they're raising the red flags. They're saying this is not going well. A lot of teachers are saying. And what's interesting is that principals generally are saying, oh, it's going great. It's going swimmingly. We're making these changes, it's fine. And the teachers are saying it's not going well. What we're being told is just stop sending kids to the office. We're being told just deal with it on your own if you've got kids who are disruptive, and they do not feel supported. So that's a big red flag we got to deal with. But there's another group. You mentioned teachers are an important group. Of course, the kids who are being disruptive, and we want to figure out better ways to support them. But we also need to pay attention to the peers of those disruptive kids, who in many of the schools that you all work in are also kids of color and kids growing up in poverty. And my biggest concern is that if this doesn't go well, if we don't get this right, we are going to have could have a very negative impact on those peers in terms of their opportunity to learn in a safe and orderly environment. I mean, our number one job as adults in the system has got to be to make sure that every child that shows up to school can learn feeling safe, being safe, and in an environment that's orderly. And if we can't meet that, we've got a real problem on our hands. So we've got to keep those kids front and center as well.
So I imagine, Secretary Duncan, you might have a different opinion. But before you get to that, I want to make sure folks in the audience know, and online, if you have questions, please go ahead and go to slido.com and enter CIS Dialogues and send your questions in. We'll be taking them throughout this conversation.
First, just appreciate having the conversation. Appreciate you telling your story and making yourself vulnerable. That's not an easy thing to do in front of an audience like this, and it sets the right tone for a really tough issue. I will answer your question directly about trying to tell two quick stories. When I took over the Chicago Public Schools, neither story I'm proud of. I'll just cut to the chase quickly. When I took over the Chicago Public Schools, I was very concerned about the number of our kids being arrested. And very early on, I went to meet with the police chief. He said, I got good kids. I don't like the school to prison pipeline. Stop arresting my kids, blah, blah, blah. He said, okay, let me look at the data. Called me back in about 3 weeks later. Police shifts are 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, 4 in the afternoon to 12 midnight, midnight to 8 a.m. The vast majority of the arrests were at 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. Our principals were calling the police. We met the enemy, and it was us. It was devastating. And we had schools that were arresting kids as many as 100 times a year. There are 180 school days in the year. That's every other day they were calling the police. Wow. So we dug into the data and found schools, south and west side of Chicago, schools 4 blocks away, same socioeconomic challenges, same issues, that had 0 arrests, and others that had 80, 90, 100. And so we did a massive effort to help retrain teachers and principals and saw very significant reductions in arrests. For me, it was always too high, but went the right way. Second one, you get to DC, you think you know a few things. We do the Civil Rights Data Collection Project and find out that across the country, we are suspending and expelling thousands of 3- and 4-year-olds in pre-K. I had no clue. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of those being suspended and expelling our 3- and 4-year-olds were black boys. So people don't like when I talk about the school to prison pipeline, but I never knew it started in pre-K. So we got to deal with the facts. And then we can talk about roles at the federal, state, local level. But I'm hard pressed to understand why any of us would ever suspend and expel a 3 or 4-year-old. There's got to be a better way to figure out what's going on at school, at home, whatever. So we can debate the federal role, we can debate whatever. And I want to be clear. This is, make the conversation, complicate the dialogue a little bit. This isn't just about overt racism, implicit bias, unconscious bias, whatever. This can be black middle-class teachers and principals struggling with lower-class black kids or Latino, whatever it may be. So this is not ascribing the cause for this. I'm just describing an outcome that's unacceptable and that we all have to figure out what we do. I think the federal role in education should be 3 things. It should be a fight for equity. I put this in this bucket. It should be a fight for excellence. It should be about innovation. And I think sharing best practices, showing what's working, data, transparency, all that stuff is critically important for the federal government. I'm always very honest. I think the current administration overtly practices racism. So to expect the current administration to really care about black and brown kids, I think we're fooling ourselves.
So I won't answer the question for you, but do you agree with this administration's decision to rescind the school discipline guidance?
Right. I do. Let me also say that as a never Trump Republican who is actually a never Trump independent after Charlottesville, I share a lot of concerns about the leadership or lack thereof at the top of this administration. But look, for years, I thought from a policy perspective, it was the right thing to do was to rescind that guidance. And fundamentally, it's because of what I said before, that if we're going to do this, if we're going to embark on this effort to try to reform the way we do discipline, I worry that if it is a top-down sort of endeavor, especially with this scary threat, the word civil rights, civil rights enforcement, that scares the heck out of school districts, as well it should. That if that's the way we're going into this problem, I worry that what we're going to see at the local level, at least in some places, perhaps in places without strong leadership, perhaps in places that are most dysfunctional, that what you're going to see is compliance behavior, and you're going to see things go sideways real fast. And that we have early indications that that certainly was happening in some places. And that this is going to be a lot more successful if communities feel like they are making this choice on their own. They are looking at their data, as Secretary Duncan did when he was in Chicago, and says, we think we can do this differently and we can do this better, and let's figure out a strategy to get there, and a strategy that brings teachers along. I mean, it's very easy to say, well, we need to support teachers, we need to train teachers. Okay, but the history of education reform is a history of us saying that all the time and never actually delivering too often. Okay, and I've been guilty of that in the reforms that I support, Common Core and curriculum and other things, is that we say it, but it doesn't ever happen. Okay, and partly, look, it's tough. If you're the Secretary of Education, we have a very decentralized system. There's no way to make it happen, right? So we need this to be something that's bottom up, and that gets buy-in from the beginning. And again, that is very focused on, if we're going to do discipline differently, then what is that going to look like? And how are we going to make sure that as we make that transition, the schools remain safe, they remain orderly, that we pay as much attention to the peers who are behaving as the kids who maybe at one moment in time are not behaving? Right? And what is our strategy to make sure that this goes well and that teachers really get the support? And do we have a way to get honest feedback from teachers, so if what they are experiencing is what your friend experienced, right? Was not intended, okay, but what the teachers are experiencing is, after all of this is, you're on your own, you figure it out, you just, kind of suck it up. You've got kids who are disruptive or disrespectful or cursing at you or threatening you physically. You've got, you're on your own. That if you make a referral to the office, you're part of the problem. That is a big issue, and it's going to go better if it's something that's bottom up rather than top down.
I think it's a really fair point. It's just, I think, a fundamental disagreement. I agree with maybe 80% of what Mike says. I just think we have to understand our history. Slavery didn't end bottom up. Jim Crow didn't end bottom up. Title IX didn't happen bottom up. Civil rights legislation, Voting Rights Acts, didn't happen bottom up. These are anecdotes, you can't do it, but we had a case, our Office of Civil Rights, where a young girl, happened to be Alabama, was raped by a football player, she was charged with lewd conduct and she was suspended. That bottom-up thing is not going to quite happen in that district in Alabama. So we should learn, we should innovate, we should share those best practices, we should do whatever. But our country's history is not one across the board of bottom-up success. It's the opposite. And that's the important role. That's the important role of the federal government. Title IX, IDA, civil rights legislation, and to somehow act like we are post that era, I think is not reality. It's not reality.
No, that's right. And Secretary Duncan, I agree. And in 2013, and in 2012, and in 2011, and 2010, there was still a mechanism, which was that, that student in that horrendous situation can file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights and have their complaint investigated. So that remains critically important.
That's fair. A complaint is after the fact, after the harm, after the trauma has happened. I think there has to be clear guidance, parameters, rules about what's important.
Right.
I think saying at the federal level that suspending and expelling 3- and 4-year-olds is probably not educationally the best thing to do. It's probably not socially emotionally the best thing to do. I think we need clarity around that, and we can't be shy to say that.
I think the thing that I struggle with is that I was supportive of the guidance. I wanted to know more about how it was working. If for some reason something wasn't going well with it, why not revise it, make some changes to it, and still keep it in place? I think what I just didn't understand was why you needed to rescind the entire thing. And I just think about when I hear the data, I hear the stories, and when I think about my friends who are teachers, I'm just brought back to the students that communities and schools serves, and the fact that I'm here as an advocate for them. We have lost generations of students over the years for a variety of different reasons through our education system, and I'm concerned the fact that we're just not moving fast enough with a lot of things that we need to be doing on the education front. So. All of that is to say, so what do we do? What are some of the solutions that we should be talking about and putting forward?
I think Mike's basic point that we need to much better train teachers and equip them and principals how to handle diverse populations, kids of real struggles. Again, we have more kids living in poverty. We have more kids living with trauma. The level of gun violence I'm dealing with back home in Chicago is horrific. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. And so there's lots of room where we can work together to hold schools of education more accountable, or figure out what we can do for ongoing training to put teachers, so your friends don't burn out and they have the support they need. So there's lots of things that we can do together to try and better equip the professionals, again, not just teachers, but counselors, social workers, pastors, nonprofits. Like, this has to be all hands on deck. Schools, and a teacher can't feel this is their job alone. That's overwhelming. And so lots of best practices, again, lots of innovation. One of the things that we tried to do that I wish, again, nothing political about any of this, is just funding what works, the Invest in Innovation Fund, where we're seeing dropout rates go down, where you're seeing suspensions go down, you see graduations going up. That wasn't my idea, President Obama's idea. That was just local innovation. Just put some resources behind it. That's a kind of federal role I think should cross administrations that, unfortunately, that got cut. I just want to be clear, again, to be honest, this administration, the education part of it, their only strategy has been to try and undo what we did. There's no, it's the funniest thing to me. I didn't spend any two seconds thinking about what Secretary Spellings do. We just tried to build our own agenda. I think their lack of vision, this gives them something to do and wake up each morning and do. So rescinding this guidance is not a standalone. This is part of an agenda that's their only agenda. It's the silliest thing to me.
Well, look, I think when we think about this discipline issue, we need to connect it to everything else we're trying to do to improve schools. Right? I mean, Secretary Duncan had a big focus when he was in office looking at these, what do we call them, the dropout factories, these big high schools that were so responsible for so much of our dropout program. Again, I know many of you in here, Communities and Schools, works on that every day. Those are the same schools that are also, by and large, our suspension factories. Right? That if you look at the suspensions, it's not like these suspensions are perfectly distributed evenly across the country, right? I mean, you've got some of these high schools that have astronomical rates of suspensions, half the kids in a given year, right? And some of those are the same ones that are having tons of kids drop out. So it's the same challenge. It's how do we fix those schools? A couple of thousand schools across the country, if we could figure out a way to fix those schools, it'd go a long way. So it's the broader, it's this broader challenge of education reform, of school improvement, of, what do you do if you've got a large high school that is clearly not working on many levels? Then this has got to be part of this larger overhaul. And so it's all the tools that we've tried before, right? It's, can you make a turnaround work? Can you break it into smaller schools and make that work? Are there cases where sometimes you got to shut it down and start over? And what we really need are brand new schools in those communities that can start fresh and try something very differently. Is it that at the end of the day, these schools are boring and not engaging, and kids are kind of sleepwalking through these schools rather than getting something valuable? Do we need to try high quality career and technical education as an opportunity? So it's the broader agenda, and it's hard. None of the stuff is easy. I do worry that we've got some places out there that are doing a great job with the model that they have chosen. We see this, I think, in the charter sector especially. But even in those schools where, you would go in and it's got a strong climate and the results are really good, but some of those schools, they do suspend kids, right? And maybe their model is they suspend a lot of kids in September to kind of send a message that they're serious about maintaining a strong climate. And then we go in and we second guess them. The state of Massachusetts recently told Roxbury Prep, where Secretary King, used to be a school leader, fantastic charter school in Boston, getting amazing results for 20 years, that they have to change their discipline policies because they're suspending too many kids. Now, in my mind, that's a mistake, okay? Because that's a school that has figured out a way to make something work for them, okay? And again, their model is that, they sometimes suspend kids to send a message, not for a long time, but to make sure that people understand this is how we do things here. And kids respond to it, by and large, and they get great results for those kids. So I just think we need to not get so much in this mindset that there's one way, that the one way is restorative justice. The one way is, keeping suspensions to an absolute minimum. Instead of saying, this is hard, right? There are trade-offs. You're trying to do something very difficult when you're trying to run a school that can get great results for everybody, when kids are coming in with a lot of traumatic experiences at home. And if there's places that are making it work, even if it's not exactly what you would prefer, we need to respect that and learn from it.
So we're starting to get some questions coming in, and a good one is, one of the top ones, is what do you believe the intentions are behind the funding for metal detectors, resource officers, and not mental health professionals or social workers in schools? And as you may know, there was a recent report that came out from the ACLU that talked about the fact that 14 million students are in schools with cops, but not these support services. How would you both answer that question?
Yeah, and so again, I dealt with this every day. So going back a few years, Chicago Public Schools, we had about a $4 billion budget. We spent every year and way underfunded, struggling for every penny to put into more education, more after-school programs, pay teachers better. We spent $100 million a year on school security. $100 million. It's a big ticket item. We had metal detectors in almost every high school, and had hard debates about whether to do that or not. And again, in a country that's gun crazed, and we saw another mass shooting at a university yesterday. As much as I hated kids walking through metal detectors every day, I could sleep a little better at night knowing that they could go to school. And we had way too many students killed, but none in schools. Having said that, I had one school, North Lawndale, one of our toughest neighborhoods, most violent neighborhoods on the west side. We allocated them, this is sort of a typical allocation, 9 security officers. The principal called and said, Arnie, instead of giving me 9 security officers, could you give me 9 social workers? Mm-hmm. I never thought of that. Never thought of that. That was a big risk. One of the most violent neighborhoods, not just Chicago, in the country. That school saw a precipitous decline in violence. And the funny thing, you have all kinds of stuff I didn't even know. We have a team that audited all kinds of stuff. Our audit team went out to make sure they weren't fudging the numbers. Literally, like they thought so. And So huge decline. One of the social workers actually helped students once they graduated from high school, that transition to college. And again, I think 60, 70, 80% reduction in violence. So the question is, again, when students act out, when they're disruptive, do we deal with that symptom, with that behavior, or do we deal with the root cause? And social workers, counselors, well-trained teachers, compassionate principals, what's going on at home? What's happening? I'll tell you one more story, too many stories. But one of the guys I work with now, one of our life coaches for our young men, he, in high school, he failed gym. He refused, they had a rule you had to change for gym, and his home situation was so deplorable, he had scabs and scars all over his body. And he was ashamed of that. And so he wouldn't change, he just rebelled. So that what the behavior was, I'm not gonna do what you tell me to do. He was too embarrassed to do that. He ended up dropping out, ended up taking someone's life, spent 20 years locked up. He's now back, amazing work with us. But had there been a way to understand why he wouldn't change his clothes, his whole life trajectory would have been very different.
That's a powerful story.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't have much to add. I mean, I think that I like this idea a lot of asking this question. Could we be getting better results with the social workers instead of the security officers? I think that's exactly right. And, you know, all I'd say is that the answer may be different depending on the school.
Yeah. So we have time for one more question, and probably not nearly enough time to answer it. What is the role of school segregation in school discipline disparities? We've kind of touched around the edges of the role that race plays in this, but you know, some might argue that this issue is driven more by poverty. Others will say that this is driven more by race. I would say that because race and poverty track so closely in this country, it's kind of hard to separate the two. So talk a little bit about that.
So I don't want to blow through race. I think racism drives a decent percent of this. I don't want to say all of it. Again, the schools where we saw huge numbers of students being arrested, those weren't all led by white principals. In fact, very few were led by white principals. Those were led off generally by African American principals. So race is real. The class piece of this is deep and more complicated. I want to get into that. I can't say the fact that we are a segregated society, is that driving this? I'm sure it doesn't help. I don't know if that's the cause of it. It's just, how do we handle children, yes, in poverty, but it's not really poverty. It's where there are huge challenges at home and in the community, where there's trauma. Poverty and trauma aren't linked. You can have a poor family and just have extraordinary resources and supports. You can have another family, more middle class, where there's this huge trauma going on. So the question for me is, how do we better address the trauma, the fear, the anxiety that you had? How do we help kids on the social emotional side, regardless of their race or socioeconomic status?
Yeah. Now, look, and we've known for decades that concentrations of poverty, it makes everything harder, right? I mean, if you've got lots and lots of kids who are coming to school with those kinds of traumatic experiences at home, it just all the other challenges that come with growing up poor in this country, that it makes everything harder. We also know that when you ask parents, about their priorities for schools, forever, and that's still true today, the number one priority, I want my child to be safe. I want my child to be safe. And so we just have to keep that in mind and not do anything that makes parents feel like their kids are not safe. And I will say this, for people out there, the advocates who want to try to push on this question of how do we break up those concentrations of poverty? How do we make sure that our schools are less segregated, less racially and socioeconomically isolated? We are not going to get there if parents feel like schools are not focusing on safety. Okay, every parent wants their kids to be safe. Parents with money have the means to be able to make sure their kids are in schools where they feel safe, right? And what we've seen in the history of this country is they will move, They will send their kids to private schools. They will they will use their advantage and their money and their privilege to do whatever they have to do. And so if we have this situation where suddenly parents feel like the public schools are not committed to their kids' safety or to an orderly environment, I worry that it could make that segregation problem even worse. Okay? And again, it's a form of inequity. Kids who are affluent, by and large, they do feel safe at their schools. They get to go to schools where they feel safe and where the classroom is orderly. And if there's a kid who's being disrespectful to the teacher or acting out constantly, that issue is dealt with. It's not fair if kids of color and low-income kids have to go to schools where they are basically told, look, chronic disorder, feelings of not being safe in the hallway, that is just what you're going to have to deal with. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind too. And you've heard me say it over and over again. Every time you think about the kids who we are serving, remember, it's both those kids who are being suspended and we could find better ways to meet their needs and find out what's really going on. And it's their classmates who are sitting next to them, who are also poor, who are also kids of color, who desperately need the right to learn, okay, so that we can close the achievement gaps, so we can prepare kids for success in post-secondary, so we can help get them on the path to the middle class. And they deserve our attention as well.
Thank you both so much. We didn't have nearly enough time to cover everything, but really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie.
So pretty. My name is Anais. I am from Los Angeles and I am 16 years old. I love all the bling. It's so pretty. The makeup brush. Makeup is one of my passions. I have a blog that is dedicated to beauty, fashion, and lifestyle. I post makeup pictures, my outfits. Makes me feel really empowered and confident. It's me. And my family, it's a really big part of me. I love school. I know it sounds like people are like, oh, I hate school. I actually enjoy going to school. But in middle school, I hated school in middle school. When I was in middle school, I was bullied for my appearance. I feel like I've overcame that stage, but yeah, teenagers can be really cruel. Oh, no quería llorar. Está bien bonito, ¿verdad? Está precioso. So when I went into high school, I told myself I can't let this keep happening. If people see me that I don't feel confident, I'm gonna be a weak target for them and they're going to keep bullying me. I took that summer to really find myself, kind of do more of my hobbies, and that really helped. El bosque está ahí, después mi blog. Having a caring adult at my school has really helped. Any school supplies, or if I just need somebody to talk to, I can always count on her. So I think I've created a bond, a really strong bond with her. I hope when people see this portrait, they see what I'm made of. I just want them to know that I've become stronger and I love myself who I am.
Welcome to the stage, the Director of Public Relations for Communities in Schools, Anya Harrington.
All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I hope you enjoyed getting to know one of our What We Are Made Of Mosaic students, Anais. She's one of several kids that are a part of this national storytelling initiative that we launched in January of this year with the goal to uplift student voice and to explore the multi-layered experiences of youth in America. As you saw in the other room, each of these portraits are assembled with elements of the students' lives that represent who they are as individuals, as well as the services that help them succeed. These portraits have been traveling all over the country, and for those present with us today, we hope that you do take the opportunity to really look closer at these portraits in the next room. And then for our online audience, we invite you all to explore the portraits online at whatwearemadeof.us. So we had a really great conversation with Secretary Duncan, Michael Petrelli, and Tiffany Miller on the national perspective and policies surrounding this very complex issue on school discipline. But now it's your turn. We would like to hear from all of you in the audience what your thoughts are on this very topic. In the moment, we'll hear from one of our representatives at Gallup. But first, I want to ask everyone in the audience to please take out your phones. We're going to go through this little exercise that Tiffany mentioned with Slido. So if you go to your internet browser and type in Slido, that's SILDO. When you get there, if you can key in CIS dialogues, that will take you to our first poll question. So I'll pause for a moment. Looks like most of you are there. Okay, great. So the poll question is, how prepared do you think most teachers are today to handle discipline issues in the classroom? And the options are very prepared, unprepared, prepared, or very unprepared. So I already see that some responses are coming through. Most folks are saying so far, 78% says that teachers are unprepared. Followed by 23% that says they are very unprepared. And only 3% so far says that our teachers are prepared to handle school discipline issues. So, without further ado, I would love to invite our Stephanie Milliken, who is the Education Director of Education Research at Gallup, who will walk us through what our public had to say on this very issue. And let's see how it fares in comparison to how folks in the room and online feel about this very topic. So welcome to the stage, Stephanie.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm Stephanie Milliken, Executive Director of Education Research at Gallup. I have the pleasure of working with our hundreds of districts, organizations, nonprofits, foundations, agencies, basically anybody who's passionate about improving K-12 or higher education outcomes. So really excited to be here today and talk about this issue of the school to prison pipeline. We conducted a brief survey with communities and schools, and so I'll be sharing results from that study. Happy to take questions after the fact if you have any. So importantly, we had a series of key findings from the work that we did communities and schools. Importantly, this is a nationally representative study, meaning all U.S. adults who have access to a cell phone or a landline device had an equal chance of being selected and participating in the study. We did a series of calls to make sure they participated, which is why when a pollster calls you, you should just answer the first time and save yourself a few extra phone calls. But when we started at the top, we just wanted to ask, what is the state of preparation from the public's point of view, as Anya mentioned? And what we found was about a third of U.S. adults felt that teachers were essentially unprepared or very unprepared to handle discipline issues in their classrooms. About 43% in total felt that they were either unprepared or very unprepared. And what we saw was that those who felt that they were unprepared to handle discipline issues in the classroom, their greatest concern of all the consequences that we know happen when people handle discipline issues inappropriately was this issue of safety in school systems. As we heard earlier, parents just want to feel as if their students are safe in their classrooms. There were some differences on key measures that we interviewed about, but importantly, there were very few differences in the perception that teachers were unprepared or very unprepared to handle discipline issues by a series of demographic variables, which we typically see in all of our polling. We do see differences on important opinions by those key subgroups. We saw that increased access to mental health services was overwhelmingly the main issue that most people felt would help solve some of these discipline issues in the classroom, similar to our earlier discussion about social workers and other resources in school systems nationally. Among the 6 solutions we asked about, which are commonly mentioned as potential solutions to address discipline issues in the classrooms throughout the U.S., we found that stricter discipline issues were the least popular as a perceived solution to address those issues. And finally, women and younger U.S. adults actually predominantly believe mental health issues, mental health access and resources were the most viable solution to address the discipline issues in the classroom. So this was the good question that you all just answered. We asked, how prepared do you think most teachers are, because we know there's tremendous variation by teacher, today to handle the discipline issues in their classrooms? And what we saw was just 36% said that they felt they were prepared. Only 7% said that they thought that they were very prepared. So a net of just 43% of U.S. adults believing that teachers were actually very prepared or prepared to address those issues in the classroom. Actually, the dominant answer was very unprepared or unprepared. So you look a little different than the national average. As we mentioned earlier, there's really no agreement in Washington on anything, but that's also true of the public, right? There's very little agreement among all the subgroups that we talk to on a daily basis at Gallup about any major policy issue that we ask them about. This was actually defying that trend. When we asked about preparation among teachers to handle discipline issues in their classroom, we saw very little differences. We were unable to detect anything really statistically substantive in terms of the differences between subgroups that we typically see differ tremendously on these issues. So 43% of U.S. adults, as I mentioned, reported that teachers were very prepared or prepared to handle these issues. That number looked very similar across issues of race and ethnicity, gender, and even the age categories that we track, which we tend to see differ pretty tremendously on issues of education more generally. We also asked them to rate a series of issues or concerns that we know result when teachers handle issues inappropriately in their classroom around discipline. And we said, among these various outcomes, which is the most concerning to you? And overwhelmingly, we heard safety was an extreme concern among those that we interviewed. This is consistent with all of our public opinion polling in the U.S., where we see safety remains the #1 concern among parents and the general public when it comes to issues in their public school systems and even private schools and charter schools as well. Now, we asked about a series of solutions that we knew had been promoted and suggested among the literature and even individual school systems nationally, and we asked individuals to rate those individual solutions on how effective they thought they would be. We received really broad-based support across 5 of the 6 solutions that we mentioned. From a statistical perspective, they're essentially tied, of those top 5 solutions. So we asked about mental health services, as I mentioned, which was the predominant solution from the public's perspective, at 60% reporting that they thought increased access to mental health services would be very effective in addressing discipline issues in the classroom. And as you tick down that list, you'll see the last solution that was interviewed about, this issue of stricter discipline policies, was the least favored by the U.S. public as addressing the discipline issues that are happening in U.S. public school systems at 21%. 21% thought that would be a very effective solution. There were slight differences on this particular topic in the issue of the subgroups of the population that I mentioned earlier. In particular, women and youth throughout the U.S. were more likely to say increased access to mental health services was their preferred solution on this issue. So while 60% believed it would be a very effective solution, we saw among women that was 65% compared to just 54% of men. And in the case of the various age groups that we mentioned, we saw that 68% of those aged 18 to 34 felt that that would be a viable solution compared to just 54% of those over the age of 65. Now, we're Gallup, so we love methods and all things data, so I have to leave on a method slide. Importantly, as I mentioned, this was a nationally representative poll. Anybody who had access to a telephone device was included in it. 70% of our interviews are done actually with cell phone users because just half of the US is only accessible via cell phone device. And we weighted the data to correct for any sort of inconsistencies in response by key subgroups of the population to make sure that the sample was truly nationally representative. My preferred finding, I think, was the 43%, and I'll tell you why. We see consistently in all of our research with teachers that they report that they're not prepared to do the job that they're asked to do. We heard that in an earlier panel. We actually see that the dominant reason most teachers report that they left their occupation in the first place was actually because they lacked professional development, at 60% reporting that that was the dominant reason. So this issue of professional development continues to pop up. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and we'll carry on with the next presenter.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for sharing with us the findings of the Gallup poll. All right, so next we will hear from our very own Communities in Schools alum, Jamal Tate from CIS of Charlotte-Mecklenburg. If his face looks familiar to you, that's because he is the cover star on our Community Matters report, so hopefully you didn't sit on him. Jamal will briefly share his story, and then we'll be joined by Karen Nussel for a fireside chat. Let's welcome Jamal Tate to the stage.
Everyone for having me here. So really quick, we've been sitting for a while. I just want you to stand up if you've ever had a nickname, whether it was from childhood, something your family called you, a sports team. You don't have to tell me what it is, but just stand up if you ever had a nickname at some point in your life. So that's a vast majority of us. Now, briefly while you're standing, I just want you to imagine if that nickname defined the trajectory for your life. What neighborhood you would live in, what type of social status you would have, and the access to employment that would mean for you. All right, then you can go ahead and be seated. Thank you. So I used to have a nickname. And for me, my nickname was very revealing, unfortunately. And my nickname was Vegas. And you can imagine, right? Depending on who you ask, who's Vegas, you get a lot of different responses, right? Some people might say, oh, he's really crazy, he's this Cali kid, and others might say, he's got some challenges. And unfortunately, if you would have asked the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, they would have said, well, Jamal Tate, he hangs out with a lot of people who use drugs and who are gang members, and he's probably not gonna end up anywhere in life. And unfortunately, at that time, that would have been true. And I just want to paint a lens around my story. I'm just going to let you know, admittedly, I didn't grow up urban or in the ghetto or in a housing authority or any other title we want to put on it. I grew up in a guard-gated community in Las Vegas, Nevada, going to private school. So I was never on welfare or any type of government assistance programs. My summers were spent in California with my family. My mom would be off traveling somewhere. And so as we look at this issue, just wanting to highlight the fact that it's not always about class. And for me, I grew up in San Jose, California, Silicon Valley, so you can imagine. And I moved to Charlotte from Las Vegas. And don't laugh at me too much, but when I moved to Charlotte, it was the first time in my life that I learned I was black. And coming from the West Coast, color didn't really mean anything. It was really just about your social status and kind of where you fit in and the activities you could do, and that's how my friends were made. And moving to Charlotte from Vegas, I had an awesome life. I got track state champion, I had a 3.5 GPA, I was going on missions trips to Mexico with my church, and then I moved to Charlotte. And for me, it wasn't academics that was a challenge. It was really the social piece of it, the social emotional development. At the time, my high school was rated the top 100 high schools in America. I got into the International Baccalaureate program. It's very prestigious. And so when I got to the school, it was a very different picture than what I thought. And I was the only, not just minority male, but the only male in pretty much all of my classes. And I wasn't driving a BMW or a Mercedes to school. And this was right after the recession. And so, times were a little bit harder. Still doing well, but not quite as well as before. And so I'm living next to a housing authority and I'm going to school and I really just didn't fit in. And as I'm trying to adjust and adapt to Charlotte and what does it mean to be a black man? What does it mean to be a black man living in the South? How do I deal with this? And my mother was working full time to support us, so she was never at home to make sure I could have what I needed. And I started rebelling. And for me, my rebellion looked like lowering my standards to fit in with others, because I couldn't go to the lunch table with the people who looked like me because I didn't have classes with them and I didn't know how to talk to them. And so I started hanging out with them after school, getting into various recreational activities. And what happened was I found myself in jail. First time, possession of marijuana, drug paraphernalia, got out the next day, and life went on. Except now I had a social group. I had people I could call friends. I had people that said they would protect me. I had people that said, hey, if you ever need anything, we're here for you. And they meant it. And so I gravitated even more towards it. Whereas my first charge was possession of marijuana, drug paraphernalia, my second charge was much more serious. I was charged with armed robbery and second-degree kidnapping. And I'm maybe 16, 17 years old in high school right now. And so my mom is freaking out. She has no idea where this behavior is coming from. She can't understand. She's telling me, you don't come from this background. You don't have to, why are you behaving this way? And I could never communicate with her because she would shut me out in conversation. And I would try and express myself, and because she couldn't relate to it, I always joke with her and say she's a valley girl, but she didn't know how to communicate. And so I never had that at home. And I'm currently 26, and I didn't meet my biological father till the summer of my 21st birthday. So I didn't have that male role model. And I'm not here to try and sell you some, oh, poor me story. I fully admit that every situation I encountered was a result of my choices. And I knew going in what those consequences would be. But it didn't matter because I had friends. And so I get kicked out of my school. I'm going to opportunity school, and I get a chance to go to a new school. And I'm like, okay, this is going to be a new me. Nobody's going to know me here. I don't have this Vegas reputation. I'm going to change who I am, and I'm going to be a good kid. Except I forgot that when I was going to my first school, I was bussed in because of the program I was in, and all of the friends I had made lived in the housing authority next door to me. And now I'm going to school with them in their school. And so I'm caught right back in the cycle that many of our young people find themselves in when they're trying to break out. They have the best intentions, they're motivated, they want to do it, but those environmental pressures make them collapse. And so I get caught right back in the same cycle, get arrested a third time for breaking and entering and larceny after breaking and entering. This time I'm 18, so it's no juvenile, it's full adult, and I'm in jail with people from as young as my age, at 18 at the time, to my grandpa's age. And talking to them and asking, why are you here? Why are you here? Why are you here? And just seeing the hope and despair and really just poverty in their lives. And I managed to get out, graduated high school with a 1.67 GPA. So I wasn't going to Harvard or Yale or Duke or anything like that. I went to good old Central Piedmont Community College. But it was through a bridge program that Communities in Schools has in Charlotte. And from there, life changed because I didn't have to be Vegas anymore, and I didn't have to try and fit in, and I could just be myself. I graduated from CPCC, did a study abroad in Peru, learned Spanish, and went to a private liberal arts school called Queen's University of Charlotte. Graduated there in 2015. And the reason I'm telling you all this is not, as I said, to tell you some poor me story, but to paint an insight into some of the challenges that our young people face. Because it's very often that we stigmatize, we generalize, and we classify people and say, oh, well, that must just be it. It's just this reason. And this issue is much more complex than that. And it's important that we have these dialogues to look at what policy changes are we going to implement to affect this. because now with the work that I'm able to do, I'm working with the police department in Charlotte for a first-time felony offenders program. So for people that were just like me in the same situation, except we're not focusing on academics, it's more so the soft skills, the professional development, the social capital. What does that look like and how do we connect them to it? Because these people are still citizens and they're gonna be here. And unfortunately, if we don't address these issues now, we're going to see incidents like what we saw in Charlotte yesterday and other things of people who are disconnected, who are enacting violent acts and targeting people in our communities. And so I'm telling you this to highlight this fact. And I would be extremely remiss if I didn't thank you, Mr. Milliken, because I've been in jail 3 times, right? 4 felonies, 2 misdemeanors. And my mom didn't have anyone to call except for communities and schools because she was working, she didn't have the time. And I remember she called Reginald Hester and said, please help my son. I was off of Reggie's caseload. He contractually didn't have to help me, but he did. And he made sure I got my schooling completed because if I hadn't graduated then, I wasn't gonna graduate. And so I wanna thank you because for me, it's been a huge impact. And I think in particularly at this dialogue, it's important that we be courageous leaders and we take that step out because not just me as a millennial, but the generation after us is watching and they're seeing how we act in this moment. And it's important that we lead and guide the way because otherwise, if you think millennials are bad, you should really see what's coming next. And so, Bill, I just truly want to thank you and appreciate you from not just me, but my mother and our family, because who knows where I would have been. And as you know, I am one of thousands of alumni who you've impacted that are going out and creating change in community. And we don't all look the same, we don't all dress the same, talk the same, come from the same places, but we're creating impact. And I just want to thank you for that. So I'm gonna come give you a hug real quick just because. Thank you. All right, sorry about that. So my time is coming to an end, but we're gonna have Karen come up in just a moment. We're gonna have a conversation about what this looks like, right? Because we can have the stories and it can feel good, and for a moment that's great. But as we know from just past in history, true change doesn't just come from courageous leadership, but through policy reform and planning for the future. So I'm gonna sit down now and invite Karen up, and I think we might have someone come up else, but thank you.
Please welcome to the stage the President of Conservative Leaders for Education, Karen Nussel.
Hello. Good to see you. Well, thank you, first of all, for all of that, for the vulnerability, just for the honesty, for all of that. And I don't know about you guys, but I could spend 5 hours just listening to this young man talk. So thanks for that. You talked a lot about sort of what was happening for you outside of school, but talk a little bit what was actually happening in school, in your classrooms. How was school leadership responding to you? What did that feel like and look like?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It makes me think of when I was in elementary school. I remember I used to go to a counselor and we'd work on skills and it'd be a small group and, it made me feel good and I'd go back to class, ready to learn. And when I was in high school, it was very different. I remember going to my counselor and it was strictly focusing on grades. So it's what classes are you taking, what classes are you in now? And I remember my mom having to advocate because my counselor was trying to put me in remedial classes. And so my counselor would ask, my mom would ask, why are you putting him in these classes? And she said, well, just based off the way things have been, we think it would be better, less challenges, he can focus on getting himself together. And had it not been for my mom advocating, I would have been in those classes that wouldn't have prepared me for any type of, collegiate success. And then also feeling like just being a number because I could check a box on a quota. We have him in this program. He fits this minority category. Great. And so I think inside the school, I wasn't receiving that support because it was like, you're in this program, you should be good, you don't need any support. handle it on your own.
Right. And so talk more to Jamal about sort of what different leaders in your school, what roles they played. So teachers versus principal. So you talked about the fact that you didn't feel like you had an advocate.
Yeah.
And even the guidance counselor wasn't playing that role. Did you have, any other folks working with you that sort of had your back?
Yeah, I remember Carlos Grant. He was an assistant principal at the school. And I remember one morning I just was having a bad day and did not want to go to school. And my mom called Mr. Grant, and he drove to my house and knocked on my bedroom door and made me get up and get dressed. Took me for breakfast, and then we went to school. And that was very impressionable for me because that was the first time I felt valuable in that school because they had told me, oh, you can succeed, you can do great, you'll be fine, but it was never reinforced through action. And so Mr. Grant, as a minority male himself, was really able to tell me, like, this is important, you need to do this, and really just change that structure. And because of his role in the school, I felt that value because the principal, was doing, administrative duties
Principal
and whatnot.
things.
Right, exactly. So having Mr. Grant really changed that. And even more, he advocated to my teachers, which I don't think a lot of young people get. As many times as I got in trouble, he saved me from, I can imagine how many, by just saying, hey, listen, Jamal's having a bad day. Be patient. I promise it'll get better tomorrow.
Right.
And it did. But had he not stepped in and had that conversation, I would have never been given the opportunity.
Yeah, so we hear a lot about that that notion that there needs to be someone that you have a connection to in your school, and that without that, you go looking for it other places. Is that sort of?
Oh, definitely.
Can you relate to that?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's why initially I got in as much trouble as I did because I wasn't a bad kid. And, I think a lot of times we judge youth for the mistakes of adolescence. I was growing up. I was still learning who I am and trying to understand all that. But having that connection with Mr. Grant really connected me to the school.
Right. Pushing those boundaries, you were.
Yes.
We all have had children who've done that to us. Okay, so I'm supposed to also remind you all here in the audience and those listening online that if you want to submit a question for Jamal, you do that through the Slido app that we just used in the poll. So please take advantage of that. Jamal, let's turn to, you mentioned at the end of your talk this notion of policy, and there's a lot of policy people here in the room. What policies do you think sort of contributed to the experience that you had? And after that, I'm going to ask you to talk to this room about, what could we change? So talk about what policy issues you felt like you ran up against.
Yeah, definitely. By far, it was zero tolerance. It was this firm stance on there are no exceptions to the rules. Everyone will be treated differently. I don't care how exceptional or unexceptional you may be, but this is how we deal with people who have this label that you do. And so for me, when I was arrested my second time, it wasn't an incident related to the school. I had never gotten in trouble at school, but because of the charges, my school expelled me. I hadn't even gone before a judge yet. I didn't even know I had been in trouble yet. I hadn't spoken to any law enforcement officials. And so what that did was railroad me, and I had to go to an opportunity school where it was a daycare. It was us sitting in a room watching movies all day, completing worksheets, and going home at the end of the day. And then even more, having that label influenced how teachers perceived me in my new school and having to overcome that. And so a lot of what I ran into is that. But then also even in the criminal justice system, my last time in jail, I was a senior in high school. I had maybe a month and a half until graduation. But because I was 18, they said I had to get a GED. And I couldn't understand. I was like, I'm a senior in high school. Why would I get a GED? Like, I'm about to graduate. And so just a lot of those policies being super stiff and non-flexible limited my options for how I could improve myself.
So it didn't matter what your circumstances were. There was a policy on paper, and that was what was happening.
Yeah, and the crazy part, in Charlotte, we have these things, end of course testing. And it's ranked on a scale of 1 being the lowest, 4 being the highest. I would score 4s on my EOCs, but failed the class because I had an excess of 60 to 90 absences. So from an academic standpoint, I had mastered the curriculum I was supposed to at grade level, but due to absences, they said you have to repeat the course.
And was there anyone in the school, Jamal, who was connecting those dots, who was actually looking at your situation across all those data points, or were they just people were acting based on data points that were isolated?
Yeah, and we actually have our executive director from Charlotte here, Molly Shaw. It was Communities and Schools of Charlotte. It wasn't until...
I didn't even know that was going to be his answer to that question. I just want everyone to know that. Sorry.
No, you're fine, you're fine. But it was Joe Rothenberg who was like, what the heck is going on with this kid? And who finally put those pieces together and helped me. But my guidance counselors didn't see it. Mr. Grant was helping me, but he had, assistant principal duties he had to do. What my teachers weren't noticing it. And it wasn't until I connected with Joe in our first conversation. He was like, what's going on? Mm-hmm. And that was really like the first time someone had asked me that question.
It's interesting because we, in the work that we do at Conservative Leaders for Education, we have a few of our in-state legislative leaders who are actually looking at some of these issues. To the panel that we saw earlier, this notion of why are there more security guards than there are counselors? Well, that's somewhat of an overreaction to school violence, mass school violence incidents. And so there's been a lot of looking at how do we figure out how can we have more people in a school who have access to this data that takes all of these data points into consideration and not just, pulling certain levels. So I think that's a really interesting perspective that you have on that from the student perspective of who here's looking at me based on all of my data points, all of my achievements, mm-hmm. And not just what they want to look at in terms of what my record is. So going forward, so you talked about zero tolerance and sort of the notion of once you got into a category, you couldn't sort of get out of that category. What kind of policy recommendations would you make to the folks in this room, or things that they should be thinking about and looking at that would have changed the experience that you had?
Yeah, so it was mentioned earlier, this restorative practice model, and I think definitely expanding that model and seeing how do we implement it within districts. I completely agree. Every state is different, and they're going to, respond to legislation differently. But we have to truly get down to the root of this whole discipline thing, and how do we change that? Because right now, what it's doing, whether we realize it or not, is it's really solidifying a student's status, and it's for the rest of their academic career. Because it's going to go with them from elementary school to middle school to high school, even to college, and they're going to see, okay, this is your academic record. Right. And why is that so important on an academic record? Now, if a student has committed an egregious crime, I, fully agree. It definitely should be, notified to the school. But for small instances that are really based off of cultural differences and a misunderstanding, that shouldn't have to be the trajectory that student will be placed on, and it shouldn't influence how their future teachers will treat them. Right. And so really looking at how do we change that, and it's not saying that we have to overhaul the whole system, but we're seeing the negative consequences of it, and it's only getting worse and worse and compounding. And so it's really up to us now to change that policy, and also reevaluating the relationship between school police officers and the students in which they're sworn in to serve, mm-hmm. and really enhancing that.
So you mentioned this earlier. Did you ever have sort of discipline problems in school?
I was never suspended. I was never got a referral. None of that.
Interesting. So this, we have a question from someone, I don't know if it's online or in the room, were your teachers notified of your legal status? And if so, did you receive different treatment as a result of that?
This is a really interesting question, right? So as I mentioned, the first school I went to was one of the top 100 schools in America. It was, it's International Baccalaureate program. And there, even when I got in trouble, to be honest, my teachers didn't care. It wasn't until I was kicked out of that school and got rezoned for a different school that my communities and schools site coordinator, prior to me coming in, connected with my teachers and kind of told them, hey, this kid's going to be coming in. Here's some of his challenges. How can we support him? And so even when I was arrested my third time at that school, the level of welcome I got when I returned was so much more significant. And I will highlight that that school was, noted as like a poverty school or Title I, if you will, and was actually shut down. But it's very ironic for me that in the school that was under-resourced and seen as a bad school, I received so much more support, not just from the teachers, but even from the principal and school resource officer there, than at the larger, prestigious school where I was really just that number.
And the teachers there were sort of like, that's not my problem.
Exactly.
That is sort of the feeling you got. Let's take another question here. Let's see. You discussed your background and certain racial stereotypes. What should policymakers know about how stereotypes impact kids' educational experiences? It's a great way for us to sort of get into this race issue.
Yeah, it influences their self-perception. And I don't think that we realize that. And that when we're telling them that you're this, you're this, you're this, and they receive that message consistently, they start to believe it, and it really becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy. And then when they see how people with that same stereotype are treated when they're 10, 20, 15 years older, they internalize that. And that's what happened with me, because I was told I am the stereotype. I started, in fact, acting as I thought that stereotype should be, the whole time never being from that background.
Right.
And that's what we see with a lot of young people trying to fit in, and especially when it comes to socialization, and that we have to be very careful, because that stereotype isn't just in an academic setting. It's going to transcend to every other category in their life. And that's very dangerous, because they're still growing up and developing and finding themselves. And if they gravitate towards that, there's going to be a lot of negative outcomes.
Wow, that's really great advice. Let's take one more. What advice would you give to the adults to help youth like yourself?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say, in Charlotte right now, they're talking a lot about social capital and what does that look like. And we were just ranked 50th out of 50th in regards to upward economic mobility, meaning a young person born poor in Charlotte is going to die poor, and a young person born rich in Charlotte is going to die even richer. And I think some simple things we can do are advocate, right? And seeing things through to the end. So if you're helping a young person, it's more than just sending an email on their behalf, but following up to make sure that it was actually fulfilled and they got the support that they needed. And we're not all, boots on the ground, I'm sure, just like we're busy people, but also connecting them to resources that are privileged to you and your network, right? Whether it's through experiences or through exposure, or, it could be tickets to something that you can't make, right? But we really have to think about how do we help them, not just socioeconomically, but really from that career standpoint. Because I believe this boils down to economics, and that if a young person has access to develop skills to whether go to school or trade or career or military, they're not going to make the decisions that we unfortunately see a lot of young people making.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, because I think that notion of social capital is really, really important. That it's not just how you score on your SAT or what even college you might get into or what certification program you go to. It's sort of the network of people that you know.
Yeah.
Right? So how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so I was, to be honest, very fortunate to be embraced by communities and schools the way I was. And so I was volunteering, and I'm meeting with board members who are, senior leaders in corporations or own their own companies. And so I was able to interact with people who, if I hadn't been a part of communities and schools, otherwise wouldn't have met. And they were able to write letters of recommendations. They were able to take me to events. They were able to purchase professional items for me. And they were really able to not just show me, but teach me, when I work with young people, say, corporate talk. Because for a lot of young people, it's hard for them to code switch and understand what's professionally appropriate, what's socially, what's personally appropriate, and having them to show me that in their everyday lives. It wasn't a fake, okay, I'm gonna come, take you and take pictures with you and show how much I helped. But hey, it's a Saturday afternoon, I'm going out to, this place, let me show you how this is done. And so for me, that was really enlightening, because I hadn't experienced that before.
Right. Do you, this is a slightly off topic, but do you feel like you had in this sort of capacity that, and ever since I think it sounded like from about 17 or so, did you have certain sort of mentors in your life that you were sort of like your go-to people when you had questions about stuff like this?
Definitely. I mean, I think mentors got me through it because academics was never the challenge for me. It was always that personal side, and having mentors who truly took me in, who not just, like I said, it wasn't just this for show thing, but it was this consistent, intentional relationship that now has developed over time and evolved. And so I think that's a key piece. You know, we talk a lot about mentorship, and I'm very cautious when using the word because from my experiences and understanding, mentorship is a lifetime commitment. Because you can't tell me you're going to help me today, and then in a year from now, I reach out and you say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm too busy to speak with my assistant. Hey, it's, you know, so it's okay. You know, we can help and coach and guide and all of that. But when using the term specifically mentor, understanding that that is a lifetime commitment and you are family from that point. And with family, no matter how crazy they are.
So that's a great piece of advice, I think, for those of us who are a little further along in our lives, that word is not one that we should take lightly because you don't take it lightly.
Very much so.
So that's really great advice. So I've been asking you a lot of questions. Do you have questions for this group? Do you have questions that you hope we go out and try to answer and solve based on how this has all played out for you?
I would like to know, at what point is it time to take action? As a millennial, we've seen a lot of conversations, and they're great and they're needed. And I think because of our energy, you know, we're anxious to help, you know, change the world. But I'm curious, how do we move forward? You know, understanding that policy and legislation takes time and election cycles and all that. But for a young person, how can we take that action? Because we realize maybe you all can't, but there's things, whether it be grassroots or what have you, that we can do. And I think I would be curious to know what the audience's perspective on that is, because we've seen a lot of conversations.
Yeah. So what is action for you? What would you say? There it is. I see it. There, it's happening.
I think action would be the progressive attainment of a goal.
And for you, that is whether that's sort of in the town you live and work in now or nationally?
I would say both.
Yeah.
We're in a global society today. So for young people, we're not just thinking about our cities or our towns or our states, but looking at what are we doing and then how do we connect and leverage that with people from maybe halfway across the world.
Right. Well, I think we are, I don't really know what time it is, but I think we're wrapping up, and I want to just one other question for you, which is again back to sort of this policy, this notion of action that you just raised, is sort of what level of leadership? I mean, so there's leadership at a school level, there's leadership at a community level, there's leadership at a state level, there's leadership at a national level, and we've talked about those different levels of leadership a lot here today. So as you navigated this system that we've designed, you know, what level of leadership made the most difference for you? And so when you want that action, where would you have us train all of our, you know, energy first?
Yeah, I think, you know, it makes me think of the saying, all politics are local. It was at that local level. Of course, it was supported from a national effort, but when I think about the people who made the biggest impact, it wasn't a president, it wasn't a CEO, you know, it wasn't a senator, it was, you know, Joe and Reggie and all the other folks. And so I think it's going to be those people who are closest to the population. However, they do need that national support because there is a lot of burnout in dealing with these issues.
Right, so there is that connection that Secretary Duncan talked about, that there needs to be a philosophical direction set, even if that action is occurring locally. But I think, proximity matters. So I think that's really interesting advice that you have for us. So I'm just going to close us out here and just point out that Jamal has like the coolest socks on. And I think we have had, yes, those are awesome. We've had good socks all day today, I feel like. But I think you get the prize at the moment. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really tall, though. It's going to be a tough picture. Jamal told me earlier he's of average height.
Whoa, that is huge. My name's Joseph. I am a senior in North Charleston, South Carolina. I don't know why, but my heart dropped for some reason. I love the puzzle pieces that he put in. That means a lot to me. Trying to put things back together, trying to understand what life is and what I am. I just had a lot of stuff going on and I didn't know how to put it all together. A lot of pieces go to my sister that passed away. After the passing of my sister Jada, my mom, she was heartbroken. Nothing can fix that. She wasn't able to work for some time. After my stepdad left, it was especially hard for her to pick up a job, and she was really struggling with bills and really trying to help me and my brothers. So as soon as I was 17, I started a job and worked as many hours as I can, and I moved up from there and helped her with bills and rent and anything she needed. I just love my mother and my family so much, but it's just I couldn't see her struggling. The whole skin is like the clock-in tickets, and it just reminds me of work. It would be long hours, and I would have very little sleep, and it would affect my school. And once I realized that, I started focusing more on that while also getting enough money to help my mom out. It's like breathtaking to me. I'm trying to come up with words, but I'm honestly just speechless. The support of a caring adult helped me through roads and obstacles. Between lunches, I would just talk about my things I was struggling to go through and just questions that I needed not a definite answer for, but just someone's input. And I felt like I wasn't alone, or I felt like I wasn't carrying everything by myself. I'm really grateful for that. Currently, I live on my own in an apartment, and I'm a senior in high school. But I'm a senior in high school that was able to invite my mother and my two younger brothers over for Christmas and feed them and let them open gifts. And really that was one of the greatest memories that I will always cherish.
Welcome back to the stage, the Director of Public Relations for Communities in Schools, Anya Harrington.
Right. So I want to first start by thanking Jamal and Karen for such a great conversation. And Jamal, you actually, that was the perfect segue when you posed the question about action, because in our final panel discussion for this morning, the theme is turning talk into action. And with that, I want to welcome to the stage our moderator, Autumn A. Arnett, who is the senior editor at U.S. News and World Report. Let's give her a round of applause. And she is joined today by some dynamic individuals. First, Lindsay E. Jones. She is the president and CEO of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Following her is Kenton Kelly. He is a student at Morris College and is a Communities in Schools alumni leader. We have with us today Judge John J. Romero, Jr., who is the president at the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And lastly, we have with us today Latia Taylor, who is a teacher at Chicago Public Schools. Thank you all for being with us today. So Autumn, let's talk action.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. So I just wanted to start off by getting our panelists to reflect on kind of some of the conversations that we've had this morning. Just opening up, can you guys share your thoughts and reflections on some of the things we've heard, maybe particularly in the morning panel?
Well, for starters, I think it was an interesting dialogue that took place this morning. A lot of the things that I would like to talk about today is reflecting on the teaching practice and how policy has a direct impact on our classroom and what it looks like for teachers and when we're encountering students that have disruptive behaviors or experiencing trauma. So I thought this morning was an interesting dialogue that happened.
I would just echo that and say, you know, we're getting such great information about what the public thinks about teachers, which is always what we seem to have, is what do people think about teachers. I think it's great to have your voice on this panel to talk about what is it to be in a room and facing the many diverse students and trying to help all of them with really different needs. So at the National Center for Learning Disabilities and disability in general is a really important part of this discussion because of the statistics and the context. We can't address these problems unless we really think about the intersectionality between race, disability, class. So I would say that it's exciting to add that in and to have your voice as a teacher and student and all of the parts of our system that have to be involved, which clearly came out in the panel this morning.
One of the things, if I may add, is part of what we're hearing so far, and we'll hear when Kenton speaks as well and others, the youth voice. We adults kind of look from the top down and think we have answers and solutions when really the youth are the experts in their situation and we need to hear more of the youth voice. The other thing I heard Secretary Duncan talk about was a focus on outcomes rather than on finger pointing and blaming, because we can do that till the cows come home, but until we have a concerted effort to have positive outcomes. Finally, the thing I have not yet heard about, and maybe I wasn't paying attention, is the role of parents. We often view parents as the problem, when really parents love their children much more than we ever could as part of an institution, yet we minimize them, marginalize them, and don't include them as part of the solution. And I hope that changes somewhat, because parents and the youth voice are the central figures in what's going on here.
So I think we'll circle back to that idea, but Kenton, if you can kick off, you are a rising senior in college now, but high school wasn't too long ago for you, and you've described yourself as being kind of a menace in high school. Can you talk about why you call yourself a menace?
Yeah, thank you, Autumn. When I describe myself as a menace, I kind of think, about back in my past experiences. I lost my dad at age 5. After losing my dad, I didn't have that, I went through many programs, I went through many support programs to help me, to get through what I was going through. But when I think about it, I think about communities and schools. This is the program that helped me get to where I was at today. After losing my dad at 5, like I said, I had a lot of fear in my heart. I didn't, I acted out, and I described myself as a menace because when I acted out of fear. I didn't know if the murderer was going to kill my family. I didn't know if he was going to kill me. I didn't know if he was going to harm somebody. So I just didn't know. I was 5 years old. So I went through school, all my life, and, with all these programs, like I said. And so when I got there, I just thought about it, I just thought about many of the other things. But what stood out to me most and what made me want to change, because I describe myself, when I say that, I describe some of the behaviors that I had, fighting, threatening, and it can go on. But the biggest incident that stood out to me the most was in 8th grade. I remember being in 8th grade, and I was at a school, where many students didn't look like me, Many students, they were different color than me. They came from, a bigger financial background than I did. And I remember one day I got into it with a teacher, and I told her I was gonna physically harm her. And at that point, that's when I realized, man, I'm in trouble. So at that point, I was charged as a juvenile. I was down at the principal's office, I remember that my principal in 8th grade, he told me, by the time you're in 9th grade, you're going to be dead, or you're going to be in a newspaper somewhere. I remember the school resource officer, saying the same thing. And I said, man, this can't be me. So I remember, just leaving out, my mom coming to pick me up, or I went to a different school, and that's when I got connected with communities of schools. When I got connected with communities of schools, that's where I didn't really pay the program much attention. But after going to high school and meeting my site coordinator, Ashley, that's when I realized that she was putting programs in front of me. The first thing that Ashley always told me, and she still tells me to today, I went to the same high school as you, so it's possible. So when I think about those things, I think about what really matters to me the most. And, these programs that's been put in front of me, such as reducing the risk or college preparation, if I didn't have a program like Communities in Schools, I don't think I would have been here right now.
So you talked about having an encounter with a teacher, and Latia, in your 2015 article that you wrote, you talked about a scary encounter you had with a second grader. Can you talk a little bit about the need to protect teachers in this conversation about trauma and how it impacts the classroom?
Yes, thank you. So I wrote this article about a second grade student, and at that time, this student was diagnosed with anger impulsive disorder. And any situation, any issue, no matter how small or big, would trigger him. So this one particular day, he became upset that he couldn't be first in line. And so he began yelling, pushing the other students. So my job as a teacher is to intervene. Well, he was very unpleased that I intervened at that moment. So he began to direct his anger towards me. He began to pull on my necklace. And the more he screamed and the more angry he became, he pulled harder. It was that situation that ultimately resulted in me being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And through that situation, I questioned my calling, my passion. I began to lose. I didn't want to be connected to the classroom anymore. But thankfully, I was able to go through therapy and work through my issues. And at that time, I became reflective and said, well, what discipline policies and practices were in place? In 2015, Illinois legislators passed Senate Bill 100, which eliminates zero-tolerance policies within public and charter schools in Illinois. And essentially, it limits the amount of suspensions and expulsions. So students that were violent or acting out or disruptive, like my second grade student, there was no consequences. And at the time that that bill was passed, my school did not have appropriate measures in place to intervene with behavioral. And so as I thought and became more reflective about that situation and that issue, I thought, well, that's just my voice. But there's millions of teachers in this country going through work-related trauma, where we're experiencing the traumas our students are bringing in our classrooms. So often policies are created, but the implementation and the support to enforce that policies is lacking. And so with SB 100, we need support. We need training. It's good to give us a policy, don't get me wrong, to say let's eliminate zero tolerance. But what are you doing to effectively help us as teachers? We're the ones at the forefront. We're the ones receiving the students. We're the ones in that classroom. And often you see so many teachers' mental health deteriorating. We're struggling in the education workforce currently with retaining teachers, with recruiting teachers. It's hard. No one wants to do it. So I believe that when policymakers and state legislators and locals, and even going down to our school districts, when you're implementing procedures, provide us the trainings to utilize and implement those procedures. I just think that giving us one PD and saying, hey, you're the expert at doing peace circles. Well, hey, we're really not. We need ongoing support. We need consistency. We need you to help us be effective in it. There's so many restorative and trauma-informed practices, but let's narrow on one. Let's implement it within our school. Get our feedback as teachers. We're the one implementing this procedure. Hey, is it working? Is it working for our classroom? Is it helping to improve our school climate and culture? And I think even when you think of restorative practice such as peace circles, you get to see the students connect with each other. and the students lean on each other as they work through their social and emotional needs, but you also see an increase in the positive interaction between students and staff. And I don't just want to say just teachers, no, all staff members that are in that building should have training done with fidelity to help them implement. And when you address those issues and you provide us with the professional development to implement trauma-informed practices, I believe it helps not only just the students, but it helps us as teachers to want to stay in the workforce, to stay committed, and to help us address our own mental health.
So I'm going to jump around a little bit, and I just want to remind the audience that you can submit questions along the way via Slido. So any questions that you have, I like interactive panels, so I like conversations where the audience is involved along the way and not just the Q&A in the last 15 minutes. So please do submit questions if you have any. But I want to jump over to Lindsay for a second. Latia talked about kind of the mental health challenges for both the teachers and the students. Can you talk about, from your vantage point, what is the role of student disability? I know we know that there are racial disparities in who is diagnosed with different disabilities. Can you kind of talk about how all of this comes into play and what policies you think should be changed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely will talk about the policies, but I couldn't agree more that the implementation and the support and the resources that Latia just mentioned are the critical factors of making sure the policy actually works. So students with disabilities are absolutely subject to discipline at much higher rates, at 25% more than other students without disabilities. So there's already an issue where disability and discipline and exclusionary practices are linked. In addition, we know that in the identification, the evaluation, and the discipline practices of students of color, that those rates are also really out of source with where we would think they would need to be. And there's no reason for that, right, other than sort of bias or the way that policies are applied. So, for example, 1 in 4 black males in school who have a disability, according to our federal statistics, every year are suspended, are taken out of school several times, multiple times a year. 1 in 10 white boys are subject to that same treatment. So that is a fact that we have, that all of our schools are reporting that data. So we can't ignore that. We need it to inform policy. Mm-hmm. And it also is just more reason that we have to have disability as a part of this discussion. The other thing I'd say is, I think that the survey today and your Latia's words about what teachers need, our school classrooms look really different today than they used to, and some of that is something we've supported for years in the disability community: inclusion. We have a lot of good research that says when you put children with disabilities, when all children learn together, all children actually do better, academically and emotionally. However, we don't have we've now pushed that policy from a federal level, which is great, but we have not seen our teacher preparation programs or our teacher licensure and certification standards do anything to provide our teachers the support they need in the classroom. So, the statistics, I think, about how teachers feel prepared or not prepared to deal with discipline in the classroom, it's very similar. We at NCLD just conducted a survey of general education teachers. We did focus groups. We did a large national survey. We'll be releasing it later this year. But only 17% of general education teachers feel prepared to serve the students with disabilities in their classrooms. So when you marry those statistics of the discipline issues and the lack of preparation around disability, again, we have to address both to make sure this issue works. And I think communities and schools is really, it's so integral for all of those, because the point of it is to bring a lot of supports in, and the social emotional supports that are needed by the students, the resources and training that teachers need, the ongoing consistent training, and from a systems level, what we need to make sure that our federal policies and our state policies support is the discipline systems that we know, the positive behavior support systems that we know that work in schools, that are evidence-based systems that keep kids in schools, keep them learning, keep them on the academic track, that they need to be on for confidence to achieve, and also can help the school kind of achieve the relationship you referenced about the teacher-child relationship that's so important to making sure all students succeed.
So I just want to stay here for just a second, and Latia, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Ask if you have any thoughts about what type of supports would be helpful to you as a teacher to kind of achieving this more inclusive goal, and also kind of marry a question that came in about whether you think teacher training programs such as Teach for America and Urban Teachers adequately prepare teachers.
I think that, well, first let me currently say that as a Chicago Public School teacher, I'm currently mentoring 3 new teachers into our district. This is their first year. I think that teacher prep programs are struggling with effectively preparing teachers to come into our districts. Again, every district may be different, but with Chicago, it's very unique with the set of challenges we face and the trauma that our students come with. I think that when you're funneling, and I'll speak specifically within CPS, when you're funneling new teachers into our district, they need to have training provided to them prior to even coming into the classroom. I currently have one mentee who is contemplating letting this be her last year. So we need to have that time to sit and go through restorative practices, trauma-informed practices. And this is something that should be taught in teacher prep programs and giving them that experience before they even get into the classroom. Because like I always say, when you enter the classroom, it's the belly of the beast. Any and everything can go. And sometimes certain things don't work, but to have consistency and support from our admin, from our school districts, from policymakers, being able to provide the funding for us to have those trainings, I think is very important.
So Judge Romero, I want to jump over to you. What do you think is the role, or how do you think that family courts can work with schools to kind of promote these restorative practices? And how do you think that schools and the court system can kind of fold parents and families into the conversation as well?
Back in 2012, when we were at the height nationally, I think, of acknowledging that the zero tolerance policy was not working, the unintended consequences of that policy overwhelming courts, juvenile courts like in Denver and in other major cities, with what really were not delinquency issues, but were behavioral issues and things that used to be resolved at the school when I was a kid 100 centuries ago. So the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, inspired by the work of Judge Stephen Teskey in Clayton County, Georgia, began the effort of dealing with what was initially called the school-to-prison pipeline, which is a term that's still being used. More accurately, I think it's school pathways to juvenile justice, and that was the project that the National Council undertook. And in response to your question, that identified a number of sites nationally where we could work with judges in that community. Judicial leadership is huge in getting that part started. We judges don't have all the answers, but there's something about our ability to call a meeting and folks will come. And it means asking, asking the folks that are the stakeholders, including parents and children, school administrators, law enforcement, and all of those who touch the lives of children, to have a collaborative effort of identifying what's working, what isn't working, because I think, as Jamal said, all politics is local. The individual issues in communities are local and should be dealt with at that level. So the judges in those communities who were leaders in their communities were assisted with facilitators. I had the good fortune of being one of those and learning from Judge Teskey and from the program of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And there were some lessons learned from that effort, things that we can do better, some of the things that worked well, but more importantly, establishing the pattern of collaboration in the community with those who touch the lives of children, and recognizing that a lot of people have answers, a lot of people have suggestions. Two heads are better than one, I guess, is one example of that. But I also want to take off on what Jamal said and underscored the fact that we have to deal with some of these things at the statewide level and at the national level as well. So the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges has an annual Days on the Hill event where we meet our elected representatives, present to them the issues we are dealing with in our court, school issues being one of them, and letting them know what we need from the Senate and from the House of Representatives to support what we do. But all of us are judges who work in the trenches at our home city with kids every day and parents every day. And I think we bring something special to those decision makers, those who have control over the purse, if you will. So I think the other effort that family court judges are engaged in, not by themselves, but with our juvenile probation officers, with our caseworkers in dependency cases, to emphasize the importance of engaging families. And what does that really mean? Engaging families and engaging the youth, because again, as I stated earlier, they are the experts in their situation. And also understanding that that each kid and each family is unique. That, they're not all cut out of the same cloth, and we can't treat everybody the same. That's kind of interesting because everybody says the law should be equal and treat everybody the same. Can't do that. You have to individualize the youth before you, the family before you, and deal with them and the unique needs that they have.
So to your point about individualizing, Jamal also talked about some cultural differences and how things are interpreted. What we might call behavioral problems might just be differences in how people communicate across cultures. Do you know of any examples, strong examples of juvenile and family courts where there's good collaboration with the schools in a way that helps to improve or continue that relationship between students and the schools, and so that the students can continue schooling and never make it to the courts at all?
In my community, there is a community-based organization, La Placita Institute. It is located in a part of our county that sometimes is viewed as, the poverty-stricken, bad kids, bad families, underemployed, unemployed, and so forth. But in that community-based organization, we from the court, from probation, from child welfare on a couple of occasions, meet with those folks on a regular basis. We were invited down to their turf. I think as the director, Albino Garcia, said, you're in the people's court now. And we have a lot to learn from engaging in culturally diverse organizations and understanding the different perspective that folks have and how they view us as the mean, nasty guys that lock kids up, when they really come to realize we're everyday human beings. We have kids and grandkids, and we're interested as members of the community in doing the right thing to improve our community. As I've said before, it's not a teacher problem, it's not a law enforcement problem, it's not a court problem. It's a community problem, and we need to take ownership for that and get engaged rather than say, not my job, let the teachers do it. I don't care if they have PTSD and are not properly trained, but we can be advocates for their needs as well.
So Kenton, I want to get your thoughts on this. Are there things during your time in high school or even now in college that maybe might have made it a little easier for you? Are there things that you feel like teachers could have done to support you or did do to support you, or things that you feel like resource officers or the courts could have done or did do to support you? Any thoughts?
Yeah, when I think about it, when we talk about this and we talk about, what goes on, it's always just a listening voice. It was often times where I would be, I'd catch myself in a bind with, maybe a teacher, and it was just, we would both be up here, and if it's two people up here, it's like nothing's gonna happen, and that's where the situation would always escalate at, from up here, and it would go from, maybe from, student concern specialist coming, and then it would go from an administrator coming, and then it would go from a police officer coming. And then when that takes place, the student gets all worried, and and at that point, that's when I would lash out, because I just feel it's unnecessary. I'm just trying to get my point across, and when I'm trying to get my point across, I don't need, the police or the principal. It was just me simply asking you to go to the bathroom, and you just telling me to sit down. So it's simple things like that makes it kind of tough, and I can probably say that for a couple of my peers too, because we've all went through that kind of situation.
So Jamal also talked about the need to kind of rework the relationship between the school resource officers and the students they're there to serve. Do you have any thoughts on how those relationships, knowing that people may come in on both sides with their own biases, Do you have any thoughts on how those relationships can be improved so that everyone can better work together?
Absolutely. For example, I know, where I'm from, most police officers, they're not hired to be school resource officers. They're hired to be police officers. And when they come into a school, their perspective is to be a police officer. I've had many encounters with school resource officers. I've had good encounters and I've had bad encounters. When I say that, I think, the training of what school resource officers are needs to be emphasized a little bit more. Only because I've seen and I've witnessed situations that I personally think that could have been dealt with from a simple conversation like what Communities in Schools does, but it escalates to a student going to jail because the police officer is not saying that the police officer is the bad person, but the police officer just was not there to listen. They were there to arrest.
Right. When I was working on research for my book recently, there was one quote that stuck out to me that said that there's this sense in schools that Black kids need to be trained and disciplined and white kids need to be taught. Latia, do you have any thoughts on how teachers can use their voices to more meaningfully advocate for students, even while you're going through kind of your own experiences?
I think one thing that teachers can definitely do is to make sure that they're part of the conversation. There's many policy organizations out there. For example, one route that I ended up taking was becoming a part of Teach Plus. And through that avenue, I was able to become more involved with policy work and really focus in on student discipline and what that looks like in our classrooms. So there's definitely many organizations that teachers can get involved with, but even going and joining your union. If your school district has a union, just to work with your union. That's another avenue to advocate for yourself and for your students. Simply speaking out to your board. I know it's a scary thought to be in front of your board at a board meeting and saying, hey, this isn't working in my classroom. We need funding for this. We don't have the resources to implement that. It's a scary feeling, but to just be a voice, I think, is the most powerful thing. Writing a letter to your legislation, getting in contact with your aldermen. I think there's so many avenues for teachers to advocate around student discipline and trauma-informing practices.
So one question that came in was about, it actually just disappeared, but it was about the focus that we put on teacher competence. And a lot of times we have a conversation as if the teachers aren't prepared or don't know what they're doing. But it can be a lot to take on kind of the advocacy role and the teaching and the lesson planning and all of the other things that we have going on. How can we empower leadership to better support teachers and students and kind of have, and this is an open question for whoever has thoughts, how can we better empower school and district leadership to better support the efforts in this area?
Well, for starters, I think we have to get school leaderships to be mindful of who are the experts. And it's us. We're in there day in, day out in that classroom. And I think a lot of time with the top-down approach, you have school leaders being shoved down their throats from network or district. Hey, you need to implement this, do that. Your data's not aligned, your students aren't performing. And in turns, they throw that down our throats as teachers. So I think we need to have a safe space where we can have that dialogue. Since we're here today focusing on dialogue, administrators and school leaders need to have dialogues with teachers and staff members about our culture and climate. I feel like that is the starting point for them to become more aware about what they need in their school building and how they need to become more competent around the issue.
Lindsay, did you have thoughts on leadership as well?
Sure. I mean, I think that's where there's a real policy opening. And there are a lot of pieces of federal legislation and state legislation, as we heard from Secretary Duncan. The philosophy that can be embedded through all of that can also be very real when implemented with school leadership. So school leaders have a ton of power in their building, as you've described. They definitely need to listen, to be open and have that community, but there are some real tools. They need to advocate also for the pieces of federal legislation and state legislation that provide money for counselors, funding for all of the educators you need in the building. And then they are in a really unique position right now because they, a lot of the new work that we're seeing in education reform or in student-centered reforms is showing us that we have to really use human capital in our schools differently, and no one has more power to make those changes than the school leader. So you have a lot of people in your building. How are you using all of their expertise? You don't need to have them so siloed. We've got special education teachers that are very well trained in providing accommodations and supports. Those could be provided to all students. All students learn across the spectrum. And we know that one of the issues that we haven't really touched upon too much, but it's engagement. We need to be challenging our students. I mean, the statistics also here that are important are the fact that students with disabilities and also students of color aren't given the opportunity to take higher level coursework as much as their other peers. And so the disengagement and the lack of focus on what the holding high expectations for them is also part of the reason that they become very bored in school. And of course, right, as we heard of the opportunity school, I think that Jamal mentioned, worksheets and sort of movies. That's, obviously someone, you would hope that someone would say, we've got people, of real caliber here, let's teach them. So I think that from the administrative perspective, they've got a lot of resources and decision-making power. They need to listen to teachers and really engage them, but they also really have to think about how they're using human capital, where they're seeking for the extra funds, and how they can provide a lot of supports to a lot of kids in ways that will really have an impact on exclusionary practices, even if it doesn't seem so direct.
One of the things that I think happens all too frequently, regardless of what silo we're working in, is talking about what we think and what we believe. Data are very important, and sharing data between the schools, the courts, and law enforcement would be very helpful to inform and guide the discussions that we take. Rather than blaming the teachers for what is going wrong or how things could be better, what are the data really telling us? The National Center for Juvenile Justice in Pittsburgh, part of the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges, does a lot of great data gathering, and through one of their new platforms, the Juvenile Justice GPS, .org, by the way, if you want to look at it, is basically inviting data to be introduced into that platform so we have more information in all areas affecting young people in our system. But I think another important issue is that historically, and I hope it's changing, teachers are undervalued. A society that pays, not anything against professional athletes, but that pays professional athletes, insane amounts of money to beat each other up on every Sunday or on the basketball court, and pays teachers starvation wages, says something about what value we place on education. That needs to change as well. And we as leaders in the community, leaders nationally, set the tone for the values we place on teachers and the product, the outcomes they produce, the impact they make on children's lives. Latonya and I were talking earlier about, just teachers and the impact they've had in our lives. One teacher in my memory persuaded me just by suggesting some things that I actually could go to college. I'd never had entertained that notion before until a teacher very subtly dropped that idea in my head. But before that, that was not even in my realm of thinking that I could go to college. So teachers are very important. We need to give them the value and the respect that they deserve, because they impact and affect the children's lives that we send there for their care and education.
So there was a question that just came up about urgency. What is the sense of urgency around these issues? Can you guys name some concrete examples of things that you've specifically seen to move the needle forward, or things that you would suggest could move the needle forward?
I honestly think first thing is, to be honest, if you were a teacher and you had to deal with me, I think you're underpaid 'cause, so I would say, I think it's all around the board. I've been doing a lot of research on it. I've been doing a lot of reading on it. I think our educators are underpaid, and I think, like Jamal said earlier, it starts locally, and we gotta make an improvement on that. If we don't put our foot down there, a lot of people aren't going to stay in the profession. I can tell you that.
In my community, one of the things that is taking place, and it's one of those things that was nurtured and provided for by the federal government, a grant that is pretty far-reaching in terms of undertaking restorative justice in our school district. I haven't heard from any of the down in the trenches teachers how they feel about that, but it's basically putting yet one other task on their already loaded schedule about being able to be trained in restorative justice practices and principles, and to employ those as a way of ensuring that problems are solved in the community that they live in, the schools, and that those who are harmed by the negative behavior of the students are involved in that problem solving, that healing part. While I think it's a good practice, back to what was mentioned earlier, are we really training the teachers adequately to be able to do that? We're putting more on their plate, but are we compensating them to reflect the additional tasks that they're going to be required to do under this practice? I think there's potential for it, but there are also some downsides if it's not implemented, as you said, correctly.
One thing that I've noticed and I spoke on that's moving the needle forward is the passage of Senate Bill 100 in Illinois. And within CPS and within my district and network, we have some schools that are implementing different trauma-informed practices. So some schools are doing peace centers to create that safe space. You have peace circles, peer juries, and even the adaptation of social and emotional learning curriculum. So we use Second Steps, which is a curriculum. So you have these things now taking place, but now it's just moving it to the next phase of making sure it's consistent and that it's done with fidelity, not just at one school in one classroom, but across the district and across the state.
Yeah, I think that I just want to echo what everyone said. And I think from the federal government's point of view, having honest data is really important, because it's really easy to, in implementation, kind of implement by anecdote and not really take a hard look at why are there these differences in statistics. To be able to look at how different things are, you have to have a federal government and the power and reach of that government collecting data. In this country, it's the civil rights data collection. We got a treasure trove of information, and we had to take a hard look at ourselves. That could be in jeopardy because it costs money to do it, and so the government has to fund it. People have discretion over what questions are asked. So I would say there's a huge urgency to making sure that the Department of Education understands how important that data is for local decision makers to make the case, for anyone to make a case in their school, and continue to take that hard look. We have differences of opinion in our politics about the importance of that data and that impact the questions that are asked and what we learn. I think it's a great opportunity for everyone to advocate. We need to know what's happening to be able to put the right policies in place and to be able to put the funding where it needs to go.
Excellent.
So we're emphasizing the onus of classroom behavior on teachers and schools. Judge Romero, how do you build student understanding and responsibility for their own actions? And Latia, you can take a crack at this one too.
I think that it's very easy to say we need to hold students accountable. I think we need to hold ourselves accountable as well. We are jointly responsible for positive outcomes. It's not just on the student, it's not just on the teacher. But to your point, I think that as folks who have contact with youth, and maybe the issue is misbehavior in school or actually involved in something that is a real delinquent act, being able to discuss the impact that has on the rest of the community, not just on the individual that was directly harmed, but how it, like the proverbial stone being thrown in a quiet pond, the ripple effect of their behavior is something they don't always understand. Being able to look beyond the nose on your face is something many of us have an issue with. And we expect that with young people who are still in the process of being molded and shaped into responsible adults. We have a joint responsibility to contribute to that?
And in my perspective, in my classroom, I teach kindergarten. So kindergarten age students are 5 and 6 years old. And it's such a pure joy and excitement I get to really mold them and help shape their minds. One thing that I'm very big on in my classroom practice is to have a morning meeting where we have time to do a check-in and we share, how are you feeling, what's something new? And a lot of times the students are talking about something that happened at home, how they felt about not seeing mom last night because mom was at work or whatever the case may be. But I've been very intentional with creating that opportunity for my students to share with each other, to share with me, and to know that our classroom is a safe space. Beyond that, using our second step, which is our social emotional learning curriculum, I also make sure that I create those times where I sit at lunch. I'll sacrifice my lunch period. I don't know if you all are aware, but teachers make a lot of sacrifices. I sacrifice my independent time and go eat lunch with my students. And I give them that time to just talk with me, share whatever they want to share with Ms. Taylor, because they look at me as someone that is a safe person, someone that they can get their little worries off their chest, all their frustrations. They may be 5 and 6 year olds, but they come into that classroom with so much background, so much trauma. So it's just my consistency with my classroom management skills and creating that environment for them.
Ken, do you have thoughts on how the students can play a role?
Yeah, I think, this most part of how students can play a role is, as long as we have those support systems in place, students can always, their voice can always be heard, their voice can always be, uplifted, just by, being able to, if they, as a student, I've always had that one voice. I'll always say my site coordinator, Ashley, she's always given me that person that I can go to. I've always, I graduated high school, 3 years ago? I think I call her almost every day now. So I think, I don't know. But, even if it's just a listening voice, I got very comfortable with that voice. And, when I say just a listening voice, if that's me wanting to call and, just to get off of what's on my chest. So it's always about the comfort level of how you make that student feel comfortable of what they're going to tell you and how they're going to tell you.
We have a question about students who may be facing trauma and are self-medicating with drugs or alcohol to help deal with that. Do you guys have any examples about how communities or your sector or organizations are kind of partnering to help address that?
Definitely. I've went to school with people who try to self-medicate themselves or things like that. But once they're introduced to communities and schools, this is a program that has helped them with some of the different programs that they put into school. It's just to help them understand that you don't have to do those things to express yourself, if that makes sense. So I've seen people get help through this program that way.
One of the things about substance use, I think, is it's very easy to look at the 20% of the iceberg that's above the water and say, you're a druggie, without asking the question. And just the fact that you're using the term self-medication suggests that there's another 80% of that iceberg we're not seeing. Right. And why is this taking place? The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges and courts throughout the country are employing a trauma-responsive juvenile treatment court for kids that come into our system who have substance use issues. And shock, it includes the parents in that system as well, the caregivers, sometimes grandma and grandpa, or auntie or uncle. But it's a more global effort to address the 80% of the iceberg we're not seeing, rather than just criminalize the obvious behavior.
So some things that I've noticed within several schools in our district, there's this concept called Parent University. So some schools have created a space where the parents and family members can come in, where there's job seeking help, where they can receive resources and support with filing paperwork for certain issues or whatever it may be. They also bring in little workshops for them, whether it's computer typing class, whether it's addressing that self-medication and alcohol. But I do believe in that concept of Parent University, giving them that opportunity as well to address their trauma.
Mm-hmm. So it looks like we have about 3 minutes left. I wanted to address the idea that in some communities, there's a distrust of the people who are supposed to be, we'll say an authority, so the courts, and in some cases the schools, and in some cases, a lot of cases, the police officers and the resource officers. How can the different groups work to help kind of bridge that trust and build a community of mutual respect?
If I may take a stab at that,
Sure.
one of the foundational principles that the council teaches our judges, and we are an organization that is about training and teaching, judicial officers, but that we cannot hope to accomplish anything if we sit in our chambers and in the courtroom without getting out in the community. And it's important that we get out in the community so that people see us as, real live human beings. One of the events, a couple of events that take place in my jurisdiction is in October. There's Make a Difference Day, and there's a coordinated effort to undertake various projects, and court personnel, including judges, put on our sweaty ball caps and our gloves and jeans and go out and do whatever we need to do, whether it's painting an animal rescue shelter or working with one of our organizations, La Placita, in clearing a field and making it ready for the next planting season. So there are ways we can be out in the community outside of our role so that people say, people see that we're invested and care about our community, not just sitting in what some people call our ivory towers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the most difficult relationships is between a parent of a child with disabilities and the school. Mm-hmm. It's a really challenging thing, I think, and the school really has to lead in that way. And just as you just described about going into the community, knowing people, getting to know who the person is. Mm-hmm. So many parents of children with disabilities have disabilities themselves, may have had very challenging experiences in school. And so they're probably bringing a lot of their own history to that meeting. And I do think there is an impetus on school leaders and teachers to take that kind of that perspective and say, there's a lot of emotion coming here. I need to be a person and talk to them a little bit across the table. I'm also hitting them with lots of terms in schools. There's a lot of, there's just a dynamic of authority that is intimidating, I think. And when you think of a parent, their most precious thing, regardless of your stereotype view of what they may be like in that moment, they're there for their most precious thing, and they're scared that there won't be a great future, or there won't be. So I do think in that, I commend you in your community for doing that. I think in the case of those conversations when they involve parents and children with disabilities as well, that the community and schools approach is terrific because it's a lot of wraparound. But there really is a moment where people who are leaders in schools have to show up for parents a little bit and engage them as people and understand the emotion of that moment so that everybody can kind of move beyond and focus on helping achieve those children meet great standards.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Communities in Schools for having us, and thank you to Lindsay, Judge Romero, Kenton, and Latia for a great conversation. We are out of time.
Look, this is the richest country in the world, and over half the kids in public school qualify for free or reduced price lunch. That's a fancy federal term for they live in poverty. 13.5 million kids in this country live below the poverty line.
It's a false premise that we can't save them all. We just haven't tried.
We've been divesting in children who need it most.
I am working with a sense of urgency that we can't do this anymore. We have lost generations of families and of children because different systems have failed them.
But if you don't equal out some of those physical and social emotional barriers, kids who start behind will always stay behind. That's what equity is about.
It's because there isn't an even playing field that we have to be there, right?
We are the largest integrated student support provider. We have a powerful voice. We provide students with whatever they need in order to be successful in school and successful in life.
Students should never have to worry about going home hungry, not knowing if they're going to have a roof over their head.
I'd much rather focus on graduation.
I'd much rather just be a kid.
As a school principal, I can go to CIS and say, this is what our kids need, what can you do?
But what matters most is what has always mattered most in communities and schools, and that's that connectivity, that seeing a child, that relationship that unlocks the potential.
Our site coordinators are there to bridge that gap and translate how communities can work in schools to line up these resources and make sure they go to the students who need them the most.
I think there's over 8,000 organizations and entities that partner with us. We can't provide direct service for every child in every school where we work. We have to have folks assist. The complexity of some of these issues requires community-wide solutions. 99% of our kids stay on track and stay in school. That's a statistic that we can be proud of. We're giving them the tools and the sense of empowerment that they can write their own story in the way they want.
I'm writing my own story, and I'm going to be the first in my family to go to university.
I learned a mantra from a young CIS student that I think is important for all of us. We can, we will, watch us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the National President and CEO of Communities in Schools, Dale Urquiaga.
Pretty good morning, right? Yeah, so I want to begin first by please give another round of applause to all of the panelists and participants this morning. Second, we have a few members of the National CIS Board, and since you are my bosses, would you please stand and be acknowledged by this group as well? And finally, I want to give my thanks to the CIS team that put this event together. This is not an easy thing to do, and it's not an easy thing to do live in front of all of you and the interwebs. So my thanks to my team and to the state and local CIS affiliates who are with us today. They are doing the work on the ground. Some are listening still by their schools, and some are with us. So just my personal thanks to the CIS staff and affiliates who are here as well. So I have the difficult task of wrapping up today. So I just have a few closing words for you to think about as we send you on your way. I want to take you back to the video that you just saw. A slightly younger version of me with a straightened up haircut. At the very end of that video, I want to remind you of the words that I quoted a young CIS student. We can, we will, watch us. I have a lot of impactful days on this job. I cry a lot on this job, usually in school, also today. But one of the most impactful days for me is the day I heard those words. I was in Nashville, Tennessee, met a young man named William, who has since graduated and is going to a historically black college, so he is a CIS success story. William had issues with anxiety and self-confidence, and his CIS site coordinator gave him that mantra, I can, I will, watch me, to get him through school. And it really stuck with me, and we use it a lot in CIS. And so it is the final reminder and call to action that I wish to leave you with today as we think about all that we've heard. We heard very specifically a sense of urgency. We heard a call to action. Jamal gave us a great definition of an attainable goal. I think that those words are a good thing to hold in our heart and in our gut as we leave today. I'll leave you two final numbers. One you already heard from Tiffany. 18 million school days a year are lost to these behavior issues due to suspensions and expulsions. 18 million. Here's a better number. Last year, 92% of case-managed students served by communities and schools met their behavior goals. Now, I can't do the math of 18 million days and 92% of kids and figure out all of that. That is what Dr. Clausen is for. But I can say that there's a math problem there that I would very much like your help in solving. We know that communities and schools has solutions that work, and we heard today lots of policy solutions that we think we can add to the communities and schools model. Not surprisingly, Communities and Schools has an opinion about some of these things. You see them reflected in the Community Matters report. So we'll give you just a couple highlights of the policy things that we think should take place, the policy actions at the federal, state, local, and frankly, individual level. Locally, you heard this a lot today, implementing strategies to help students build relationships and develop social emotional skills. That is what we do at Communities and Schools. Good schools, even where we are not present, do that. Good courts do that, we heard from the judge today. And so in the way that our site coordinators use informal check-ins or morning circles, as you heard about from our teacher, allowing students to share what happened, we think that is a practice that can be instituted through district policy at the local level. You heard a lot today about restorative strategies like peer mediation, restorative circles, reflection rooms. A common approach that CIS uses is PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports, focusing on school-wide strategies. There's a real call, I think, for a change in local practice. Those are things districts and schools can do on their own. State policymakers, we think, have solutions that they can take up. Strengthening reporting requirements in ESSA to require regular disaggregation and analysis of behavior data. We heard data a lot today. That disaggregation and reporting of these behavior data points in the way that Communities and Schools uses our data to inform decisions to deliver the right supports. If states enact laws about disaggregating this behavior data, then locals can respond more appropriately. You heard this recommendation a lot. It's nice to know that people agree with us. Include trauma recovery resources and crisis response inside schools. We simply must do more to address trauma and provide trauma-informed care and training for adults who have to deliver it or be aware of its need for our students who face crisis. Whether we like it or not, as I said in the beginning, anxiety, depression, these issues are on the rise in our nation and in our schools. And so this is an important policy initiative at the state level that Communities and Schools supports. Nationally, our action items going into the next year, the 2020 presidential campaigns, include this. We believe simply America needs to invest more in prevention than in building juvenile justice detention centers. Simply put, Communities and Schools will advocate for more federal investments in our children who have the greatest needs. Nationally, we will continue to hold up the work of our state and local affiliates. That is part of our job. You heard the all politics is local, but you need a national umbrella for that effort. We think that's our job, is to lift up the work that is going on locally. Communities and Schools prides itself on a research and evidence base. And so this summer, we will translate the Milliken Dialogues into a research convening about student behavior and school discipline. And we hope that many of you will join us there as we dig deeper into our data and think about what our research agenda needs to include in the future. So there's some federal, state, and local policy ideas. There's also some for us as individuals. I think we heard loud and clear today a reminder to look inside ourselves and acknowledge implicit biases that may drive our adult behavior. Communities and Schools has committed each member of our team to a diversity, equity, and inclusion imperative. I know many of you in this room have done that yourselves and your organizations and have led for years in that space. I think we need to all commit as we leave today to make that journey together. And I think we also must acknowledge we have miles to go before we rest on that particular journey. But I think there is work for us as individuals. Listen, Communities and Schools doesn't have all the answers. Sometimes we think we do. I heard a lot of things today. I heard about teacher pay. I heard about parent university. I heard lots and lots and lots about data. I heard from both sides of the political spectrum, which made me really happy, that any discipline reforms must have teacher buy-in in order to be successful and need to ensure a safe and orderly environment for all students. That this is about all students and that teacher buy-in and school buy-in are just imperative to making proactive change. I also heard today implementing disciplinary protocols that are informed by restorative practice, things that we believe at community schools. And I heard today, at what point do we take action? Where is the sense of urgency? My board is here. My board often evaluates me and reminds me that I am an impatient old man at this point in my life. And this is why I'm an impatient old man. When I see young people and middle-aged people and older people like me on this stage universally say, "Can you go any faster?" And I have to say, well, systemically, no, I really can't. It really eats at me. And so our final ask, my final ask of this room today is that you join our organization as we move forward and that we try to do much more of this together. I hope that you heard things you agreed with today. I hope you heard some things you disagreed with today. I thought there might be more disagreement. Next year I'm going to pick up like more awful topics so that we can sell tickets. I hope you will think about this more. I hope you will continue to tweet at #CIS Dialogues. What did you hear? What did I say that offended you? What on stage needs to be lifted up? We hope to continue to build that record. And as you do that, and as you are sending that in, I have a couple last things that are very important to me to do. I'd like to recognize our event sponsors who helped make this year's Milliken Dialogues possible. Those sponsors are AbbVie, Altria, the NFL Players Coalition, and the Robertson Foundation. They have already taken action in putting dialogue into practice, and so please give them a round of applause. Today marks exactly 2.5 years that I have been the president and CEO of CIS. It's sort of my anniversary, bosses. I'm still impatient. One of the first people I met when I got this job was a judge from Oregon, a colleague of Judge Romero's. She was, at the time I met her, the sitting president of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And she and their CEO graciously were one of the first meetings that I had in this job. We met here in Washington, D.C. And I was like giddy with excitement that I had my big new Washington, D.C. job and I had a suit on, and I was just eager to change the world on behalf of students. And the judge looked at me in a way only a judge can, and said, "That's very exciting, but do me a favor, get it right, because I don't want to see your students in my courtroom." Now, I am fortunate. I was not a court-involved youth and have not been a court-involved adult, but I take judicial orders seriously. And so when a judge says to me, "Get it right," I have tried to internalize that for the last 2.5 years into this work. And what I saw today was a lot of adults in this room trying to get it right for kids who deserve all of that and more. Communities in schools and you can continue to work to get this right for kids like we saw today, young adults now, Jamal and Kenton, but all of the kids in this country, those served by communities in schools and those not. Whether you agree or disagree with our view of restorative practice or use of data or trauma-informed care, whether you are on the left or the right or in the middle, I do not care. But because I know in my heart you share the same commitment to continuing this dialogue, showing them how it's really done, and getting it right for kids in this country. Thank you very much for spending your morning with us. I hope you enjoyed yourself as much as I did. And now it's time to get to work and to get it right. If I can go back to that video and paraphrase my friend William just a little bit, we can, we will. Don't just watch us, join us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Have a great day. God bless you.